President Biden held his first formal news conference Thursday, 65 days into his term. He took questions from reporters for close to 90 minutes. The news conference began with the president doubling his 100-day vaccination goal. He now says he wants 200 million shots administered in the same time frame. The U.S. already surpassed 100 million shots last week. But when the questions began, two main topics dominated: the surge of migrants at the border and the filibuster. President Biden rejected the idea that more people are coming because of the change in administration. He also pushed back on the notion the current influx is out of the ordinary. The government is struggling to house migrant children and teens who've come alone. Despite this, the president committed to allowing unaccompanied minors to stay in the U.S. while they wait for their asylum cases to be heard.
If an unaccompanied child ends up at the border, we're just going to let them starve to death and stay on the other side. No previous administration did that either, except Trump. I'm not going to do it.
President Biden has immigration bills he wants Congress to pass, but while the filibuster is in place, those bills are likely going nowhere. Most legislation needs 60 votes to pass the Senate under current rules. Democrats have 51, and Republicans have shown no signs of cooperation. Yet President Biden says he's still holding out hope for bipartisanship for now.
I think my Republican colleagues are going to have to determine whether or not we want to work together, or they'll decide that the way in which they want to proceed is to just decide to divide the country, continue the politics of division. But I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to move forward and take these things as they come.
One more piece of news. President Biden, already the oldest president in U.S. history at age 78, says he wants another 4 more years after this term, for now at least.
Have you decided whether you are going to run for re-election in 2024? You haven't set up a re-election campaign yet, as your predecessor had by this time.
My predecessor needed to. My predecessor. Oh, God, I miss him. No, an answer is yes. My plan is to run for re-election. That's my expectation.
So let's turn right now to Ed O'Keefe, Caitlin Huey-Burns, Zeke Miller, and Eugene Scott joining me now. Ed is CBS News senior White House and political correspondent. Caitlin is CBSN's Washington reporter. Zeke is a CBSN political contributor and White House reporter for the Associated Press. And Eugene is a political reporter for the Washington Post. Welcome. Well, this is the day I know you all were waiting for, that first formal news conference, a chance to ask in an extended way questions. And Zeke, you kicked things off asking the president about how he plans to get things done with the filibuster still intact. How much movement did we see in the president's position?
Yeah, we saw the president, who has previously been resistant to changes to the filibuster, really push him move closer to that direction, to embracing some change, if not full on overturning that legislative impediment to his agenda. At the same time, we also saw the beginnings of what is expected to be a political argument, a political line of attack from the president. Number one, as he's currently on the road show for his American Rescue Plan, that $1.9 trillion relief bill, but also as he looks forward to infrastructure and the rest of his agenda, whether it be immigration, gun control, voting rights, and climate change. The president essentially putting the ball in the Republicans' court, trying to reframe the discussion from how he's going to pass his agenda to, are Republicans really going to block it? That's a very nice political soundbite. The problem for the president is, without changes to the filibuster, that's not a legislative one. That doesn't get him the political victories that he's going to get, the legislative victories he's going to need to fulfill his promises to voters. So that coming in tandem with that sort of opening the door to substantive changes to the filibuster really could signify a very different Biden administration than maybe we imagined just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, so I mean, Ed, Zeke really went through it in a very thorough way there on this question of the filibuster. You know, when people hear that, they may wonder, why is so much of the focus centering on this thing that sounds like it is another Washington procedural kind of technical thing. But when you look at how critical this is to the Democrats' agenda, to President Biden's agenda, What are the stakes here when it comes to the filibuster?
Yeah, this is possibly the most procedural of procedural questions you can ask, because it is about a procedure. But it's one that needs to be asked and hasn't been able to really be asked of him directly at all since he began. It's come up in a few interviews he's done, but we haven't been able to ask him about it at length since he took office in this kind of a setting. And it's a critical question to be asking because so much of his agenda will inevitably hit a Republican roadblock of some sort in the Senate. And, whether it's immigration, gun control, climate change, voting rights, and we saw his strong reaction to that. And so it's worth asking, well, what are you willing to put on the line if you hit that Republican roadblock, known as the filibuster, and have to decide at that point, do you just let it, wither on the vine because of that, or do you find a way to fight, as your party is now urging you to do? You heard him not rule it out, but also say we're not there yet. Mm-hmm. and tout the fact that he has a unique understanding of what it takes to cut a deal in the Senate. That's true, although he hasn't served with most of the senators that are actually there now, and they have a far different way of doing business than the Senate conducted business when he was there. So I understand that there are people out there concerned that other questions weren't asked, and there were so many on this, but really, at some point after the Easter breaks in the House and the Senate's going to bring up something. We don't quite know yet what specifically it will be, and it very well could be met with a Republican filibuster. And the question will be, how much patience is there in the Democratic Party to address that and to possibly confront that rule, or cut a deal, or lose that fight and move on to the next thing and possibly face yet another one. So that's what had to be asked. And, this is a White House that's been very disciplined, trying to focus on pandemic relief, the bill he's going to introduce next week. But there are other things that are worth asking him about, and this is certainly one of them, because some kind of collision course is coming.
Right, because when people ask the question, why don't things get done in Washington, central to that right now is the filibuster, right at this moment anyway. So Caitlin, I want to play another clip of President Biden's response to our chief White House correspondent, Nancy Cortez, asking if he's worried about losing congressional seats if Democrats can't counter Republican state voting restrictions. Let's listen to that.
What I'm worried about is how un-American this whole initiative is. It's sick. It's sick. Deciding in some states that you cannot bring water to people standing in line, waiting to vote. Deciding that you're going to end voting at 5 o'clock when working people are just getting off work. Deciding that there will be no absentee ballots under the most rigid circumstances. I'm convinced that we'll be able to stop this because it is the most pernicious thing. This makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle.
So you have been covering this extensively. Explain the battle between state Republicans and federal Democrats on voting.
Well, on this issue of voting, we've seen it become a significant animating issue for both sides. At the state level, you have Republicans in Republican-led legislatures in reaction to the 2020 election introducing a variety of different proposals in their states designed to curb voting access. States that Biden won, but also states that President Trump won. States like Iowa, which signed a bill into law recently, which would cut back on the number of hours for early voting and election day voting. That's a state that Trump won overwhelmingly, and a state that saw record turnout. So Democrats have tried to counter that from a federal perspective, pushing H.R. 1, now S1 in the Senate, this massive voting-centered piece of legislation that would require automatic voter registration, would expand vote by mail, reform gerrymandering. They believe that that is the answer to a lot of what is going on in the state. So this has become something that we found in our reporting, that Republicans are extremely animated about opposing, and Democrats are extremely energized by this issue. And that's also why you see this focus, again, to go back to the filibuster, because because advocates have argued that voting rights is the issue to tackle the filibuster because that had been historically used to try to stymie civil rights legislation. But it's important to kind of offer some reality checks here, too. This legislation that is currently in this or introduced this week in the Senate on voting rights doesn't have any bipartisan support, and it also doesn't necessarily have the support of all of Democrats. Joe Manchin is someone we've been watching on this. He said today that he wants to see a bipartisan approach to addressing this issue. So the votes aren't there, and also the votes aren't there to reform the filibuster. And also, as we're tracking what is going on in these states, yes, there have been so many proposals to significantly roll back voting access, and that's important to note. But it's also important to watch what is actually getting passed. So there's a key bill in Georgia right now that is headed for passage that has been watered down from its original intent. Originally, it was designed to eliminate absentee voting altogether and try to eliminate Sunday voting, which would have, of course, targeted black voters. This version limits absentee drop boxes. It has some other measures in there, like voter ID strengthened, that caused some concern, big concern for voting rights activists, but it also includes some expansions to early voting. So kind of tracking how this proceeds, but Democrats say they're introducing these bills, and in order to stop that, federal action needs to be taken.
Eugene, to pick up on what Caitlin was saying, we heard that Jim Crow comparison to voting rights just there. President Biden was directly asked if he views the filibuster as a Jim Crow relic, which is what former President Obama called it. Now, he agreed, but didn't think that means it's time for it to go. So how does he walk that line there? And how does that fit with this connection that activists are drawing between voting rights and the filibuster?
Well, it's going to be a hard line to walk because many supporters of the presidents on the left who have a deep history of the civil rights movement can point to examples that were used in Congress, obviously, during the civil rights movement to keep legislation moving forward that would have changed significantly the lives of Black Americans, particularly when you think of like anti-lynching bills. The filibuster was put in place or used in those moments, should we say, to keep that from moving forward. It is true that this is something that has deep ties within this country's racism. And so it's also true that it's not always been used for that. And Biden wants to be careful about communicating that anyone in support of a filibuster is racist. And this is a line we saw him walk while he was running for president, going as far as obviously calling out his former opponent on his actions and ideas that were racist, but not necessarily many of the people who supported him. And this is going to be tricky as he seeks to try to carry out his agenda, but trying to find a way to do it without moving forward aggressively with getting rid of something that so many in his party want him to get rid of.
All right, now I want to turn back to the border, Ed, which is such a big focus right now. Give us a reality check, Ed, of what we're seeing at the border right now. How unusual or out of the ordinary is this surge that we're seeing? And, you know, I wonder what we know at this moment about the reasons that people are actually giving for why they're coming right now.
Well, what is unusual is that it's happening this early in a calendar year. Usually the surging begins in the spring into the summer when the weather is a little warmer, although not its warmest. The president made it sound as if these kinds of surges are typical in January, February, March. They're not. They're usually typical in March, April, May, maybe parts of June, because they don't want to be going out when it's too cold. They don't want to be going when it's too hot, but they do it when the weather gets a little better. And you see here this graph that points to the surging over the last several years. This is from Customs and Border Protection. Low in 2018, picked up again in 2019, low in 2020 because of the pandemic, and now on course potentially to be higher than 2019 if that blue line continues climbing. What causes this? It's all sorts of things. It's not just an election in the United States. It's the lack of political leadership in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and some of those other Central and South American countries. It is the fact that there were two massive hurricanes that hit that region last year and has caused even more economic desperation on top of a pandemic that has led to death and disease in those countries and a lack of economic opportunity. You have governments down there that are simply dysfunctional and do very little to stop this flow because they understand that ultimately if their former citizens get into the United States and can get a job, the remittance payments will help fund as much as a third of their economies. So there's no financial incentive for those countries to stop their own people from leaving. And, and yes, the coyotes or those that are encouraging people to take these trips are probably touting the fact that there's been a change in leadership, that Donald Trump is no longer in charge, that the wall isn't going to get built anymore. That is a reality as well. And so it's a myriad of issues. It will ebb and flow over the course of the Biden administration, but it's certainly ticked up considerably here in the last few months. And when the Biden administration inherited the issue, it obviously is something that they're now facing a lot of questions about. And you could see him get defensive about it. You could see him try to toss it back at the Trump administration. But the reality is now, about 64, 65 days in, it's now his issue, his concern, and his administration is going to have to sort it out. And they also stumbled out of the gate. I mean, this idea that don't come now versus don't come at all this way, that I think is what allowed some of the opening for the criticism and the skepticism about what they're trying to do. And it is an incredibly tricky issue that has bedeviled administrations of both parties for most of this century. And it's going to take a lot of work by the administration, by Congress, by diplomats, and by foreign governments, frankly, to sort this one out.
So, Zeke, President Biden says he makes no apologies for reversing Trump immigration policies, but one that he has kept is Title 42 that allows the U.S. to deny asylum or refugee status due to the pandemic. Now, this is something he's negotiating with civil rights groups. But, Zeke, how complicated is this? Because you heard from Ed the messaging that the administration has been trying to send, both at the beginning of the administration and then in this moment. But now with Title 42 being kept, these civil rights groups are not at all happy about the fact that this administration has decided to keep this.
Yeah, this is really emblematic of sort of the two-step the Biden administration is doing that Ed so ably laid out there. There's at once this the border is not open now, don't come now, but while also saying the administration is working toward a more quote unquote humane and well thought out immigration and asylum process down the line. That rhetoric is having an impact on migration. When my colleagues talk to people across the border, they're hearing it because of the change in administration. When it comes specifically to Title 42, I mean that was a measure the Trump administration invoked at the onset of the pandemic as part of this sort of absolutist view toward migration in general. As part of the broader Trump administration's policies, is always by intention designed to be deliberately meant to be a disincentive on migration. It was whether it be family separation, it was you can call it inhumane, you can call it a harsh, whatever label you would like to put on it. It was designed to deter people from crossing the border. The Biden administration is taking a laxer view on that. Because then the president is saying he's making no bones about trying to adopt a policy that doesn't separate children from their parents. And that is, he ran against that. He was outspoken against that. But at the same time, because of that policy, there are going to be consequences when some of those are what we're seeing now. It's, President Obama used to say when he was office, and a phrase I'm sure President Biden heard a lot while he was in the Obama administration as well, was, no easy decisions come to the president's desk. And this is the example of a very difficult one for the administration. It's one that they perhaps didn't quite foresee all of the unintended consequences, or just how much pent up demand there was for this sort of migration. And that's why we're seeing this issue really come to a head over the past couple of weeks.
Caitlin, switching gears, President Biden made some news this afternoon when he said that he is planning on another presidential run in 2024, but he had some qualifiers to that. What did he commit to?
That's right. And he said it's, quote, my expectation to run. And then he also said, look, I'm a great respecter of fate. I can't really plan for 3-4 years for certain. So kind of qualifying that a little bit. But the reason that this is an issue is, number one, his predecessor, Donald Trump, filed for re-election on day one, on Inauguration Day. President Biden has yet to do that. But also, this was an issue during the campaign. There were a lot of questions about whether Biden would run for a second term if elected. He is the oldest president in history, so there were these questions about age. And for some voters that we talked to during the course of the campaign, that placed greater scrutiny on the choice for a vice presidential candidate as well. So this question of whether he would serve another term, he said that that is certainly his expectation. It does seem a little bit early, perhaps, to some of our viewers to be thinking about 2024. It seems like the past election is just slightly in our rear view at this point. But Republicans on the other side are already starting to gear up, and that list of potential rivals, if Biden does run again, could be pretty lengthy.
Eugene, President Biden has often avoided discussing his predecessor, former President Trump. What did you make of what we heard from President Biden today on that?
Well, I think what Biden was trying to do more than anything was communicate to voters that he was moving America in a direction quite differently from his predecessor, because that is what he ran on. That's what he tried to convince many former Trump supporters that he would do. And he tried to make distinctions in ways related to issues of demeanor, even interacting with media, policy related to immigration, and also on voting rights, especially related to matters of race, that would lead people to walk away from this moment saying that it is a new day and we are in a new era. This is something I expect him to further move forward on, but probably will get more frustrated about moving forward if he continues to have to answer questions, should I say, about his predecessor. But it's not surprising that, within these first 100 days that people are noticing and want to know how he feels about how just differently things are going, given his new position in the Oval Office.
All right, Ed O'Keefe, Caitlin Huey-Burns, Zeke Miller, and Eugene Scott. I looked it up, just over 1,300 days or so until Election Day 2024. Thank you all so much. Thank you.